Hey everyone, welcome back to Embroidery Tutorials, where we are still stitching through my 90 variation chain stitch sampler. We are currently starting circle number 4 out of 7. We've already done about 40 different variations of chain, and we are just going to keep plowing ahead with another 14 on this circle. So if you would like to follow along, feel free to go pick up a pattern from my Etsy shop, or just grab a needle and thread and some fabric and just follow along on your own. Either way, it's all good. Today we are going to be talking about whipped chain. So I'm going to start out with some whipped fill, and then we're just going to do some different variations of whipped chain in a line, which means I am going to be jumping ahead from the very first stitch in this circle to the outer circle, which is the very last stitches. So sorry about that not going in order, but you can definitely fill it in that way. It's not going to make any difference for you. But when we get to those whipped chain stitches around the outer edge, that's why everything else inside the circle will already be sewn. Spoiler alert for the next tutorials, but we will definitely be catching up with all of those inside stitches starting with the next video. Just a little warning in advance. So we're going to be starting with this little sort of moon shape in the center, and this is going to be our chain fill with whip stitch added on. Whipped chain fill. Now I'm considering this different than just whipped chain stitch, which we will do next, because when I do chain as a fill and then add whip stitch to it, I don't just whip each line of chain separately, I actually whip the lines to each other, which makes a whole new texture and actually kind of combines the look of like the interlocking chain fill with the look of whipped chain. It looks cool in my opinion. It's a different thing. So we're going to start out by filling our little half moon shape here with chain stitch. You can experiment right now, do something different than the chain stitch fill we did before. So you can see I'm going to be doing lines of chain stitch rather than that sort of outline towards the center method that we did the last time we did chain stitch fill. This is just a different way that you can do it. You can do whatever you want. The whip stitch will work regardless of how you fill this shape up with chain. But go ahead, fill the whole shape up, and then we're gonna move on to the actual whip stitch part. Once your shape is completely filled with chain, we're gonna rethread your needle with a different color. You don't have to use a different color, but why would you not? And then we are going to start whipping our chain stitch. So like I said at the beginning, we're not just gonna whip each line separately, we're actually going to whip the lines together. So you wanna start by coming up in between two of your lines of chain. And you could do this again from the inside out, outside in, depending on how you filled up your shape. You can do this in a lot of different ways. I've actually used whip stitch on chain to make really cool patterns and textures before that have like a rug-like woven sort of look in the end. You can get really creative with it. But I'm just gonna come up between my first two rows of chain, and then I'm going underneath the right side of one chain stitch and the left side of the other one. So I'm drawing those two chain stitches towards each other, not going under the entirety of both of them, as that would just yank it into the center and it wouldn't look very good. It would make lumpy lines. But I'm pulling the inner legs of my little chain stitch loops towards each other by threading my whip stitch through it. And we're just going to continue doing that. You can just keep going, threading together each little loop of chain so that we're connecting our first and our second row with whip stitch in the center, and you can see it gives a really cool texture and your added color here of the whip stitch on top. Once you get to the other side, go ahead and go back down through the fabric and then come up between your next two rows. You don't necessarily have to do this, especially if you did the outline version of filling it in. You may not have to go back down through the fabric at all. You might be able to fill your entire shape without ever going back down through the fabric until the very end, and that's perfectly okay too. For the style that I have here, it's going to look best if I go through the fabric and come back out between the next two rows. Now as I start going in the other direction, I'm going to be whipping in the opposite direction so that my whip stitches go back and forth once we get to the end. You'll see the texture overall kind of pointed out that my whip stitches are going to kind of triangulate and be pointing towards each other. So the direction that you're whipping, whether you're bringing your needle underneath the legs of the chain from right to left or from left to right, determines which angle your whip stitch is going to be on when you finish and you look at it. So think that through as well. You can do it so that all of your whip stitch is in the same direction. You can do it alternating, which is what I'm doing here. You can do a few lines in one direction and a few lines in the other. This is how I got really interesting texture on pieces before, and honestly, this is a really fun technique to play around with. It can take a little while and it can take a little thought process if you're trying to get some really complicated and complex patterns in there, but it ends up looking really cool. And I'm just going to continue doing this all the way to the end. As I get to the end of each row, I'm going through the fabric and then I'm coming back up between the next two rows and whipping those two rows together in the opposite direction. I'm going to just keep whipping until I've filled up my entire shape, and you'll be able to see this great texture on top of my chain stitch. I love the look of whipped chain stitch. It's so much fun, it's so easy, and it adds so much more complexity to your texture just by adding this really simple stitch on top. All right, now that we have filled in that central shape with chain stitch fill plus whip stitch, we're going to do some chain stitch outlines with whip stitch. So we are jumping ahead to the outside ring on this circle. Ignore all that stuff in between. We're gonna get to that in future tutorials. We're gonna start out by chain stitching our entire circle. I've split my circle into thirds because we're gonna do 3 different versions of whipped chain stitch here. And I've done each third in a different color just to make it more obvious for this video which one is which. You can just do it all one color if you want. That's perfectly fine. You can do forward, you can do backwards, it doesn't matter. If you don't know how to do the original chain stitch, I'll link the video up in the corner here, but I'm not even gonna show this part because there's a lot of regular chain on this circle, and that's not really the important part. We all know how to do that part. What's important is what we're gonna add to that chain. So once you've got your entire circle filled with regular chain stitch, we're gonna move on to the whipping part. We're going to start out with regular whipped chain stitch. So you're going to start in whatever third of the circle you very well please. You're going to thread your needle with a different color, and then we're coming up right at the beginning of our third of the circle. You can come up in the middle of that first chain loop, at the point of that first chain loop, whichever one you very well please. And then we're sliding the needle underneath that first chain. We're not going through the fabric, we're not going through the threads, we're just going between them. And that's it. You just keep doing that. It couldn't be easier. You're just going to keep looping your needle underneath each chain. If you're going from right to left, you stay right to left all the way to the end. If you want to do left to right, it's left to right all the way to the very end. What you don't want to do is start alternating. If you do right to left to right, right to left to right, you're now doing interlace chain, which we're going to get to that. It's also on this circle, so that's going to be a later tutorial, totally different stitch style. So here you're going right to left or left to right all the way to the end, and when you get to the end of that third, you can just go straight back down through the fabric in the center of your last little loop there. Or if you just want to keep the same thread, you can carry on to the next third where we're going to be doing a slightly different form of whip stitch around our chain. So now that we've done some single whipped chain, we're going to complicate matters just a little bit, and we're going to do a double whipped chain. So we're doing 2 rows of whipping that are only around the outside of each loop. You'll see what I mean. It's really easy still. And we're going to do inward and then we're going to do outward. And that just means which way we're going through the loop. So it's kind of like before I said you could go right to left or left to right. It's all still whipped chain. Here, if you go left to right or right to left, it kind of makes a difference in how it looks in the end. I think the coolest part about this double whipped chain is that it ends up looking almost like that magic chain that we did before, but with the loops really laying on top of each other. And quite frankly, it's way easier than magic chain. So if you want to get this cool alternating color sort of candy cane effect with your chain stitch and not go through the, pain in the butt that magic chain can be sometimes, try out this double whipped chain. It is so much easier, it's so fun, and I love the texture and the color differences it gives. All right, so first up, we're going to do inward double whipped chain stitch. These names, so long. Which means we're going from the outside in. You're still only going under one leg instead of 2 legs, so you're only going through the one side of each chain loop because we're going to come back in the other direction and go under that other side. So you're going to start by coming from the outside of your chain, going underneath that first leg and coming up in the center of the chain. And you're just going to keep doing that all the way to the end of this third. You're going from the outside and then you're going towards the center all the way until we get to the end of your third here, and you should have one side of your chain stitch whipped. Once you get to the very end of your third here, you have a couple options. You could either go back through the fabric, tie off your thread, and then go back to the beginning of this third, in which case you'll be doing the exact same thing on the other side. You'll still be going from the outside in, outside in, all the way to the end, so that you have this inward look. Or, I'm going to show a little bit more of a confusing way here. We can just loop around our final loop here, so we're going to slide our needle underneath the other leg, and then we're just going to come back in the other direction. So in order to keep our whipping in the same direction, even though we're moving the opposite direction, so we still want it to be inward whipped chain, not outward, but we're now coming from the opposite direction as what we were before. So we're actually going to go inside to outside now instead of outside to in. So we're going from the center of our chain loop and sliding the needle underneath our other leg towards the outside. And you're going to keep doing that all the way back to the beginning of this third. So you can see how our double whipped chain is now sort of getting this, it's almost like little hearts tied into each other. So we're drawing the two sides of our whipping into the chain loops in the same place, even though we're going in the opposite direction as we were originally. I hope that's not too confusing, but I think you can see really clearly in the video how you have to change your direction in order to make it match the first side. So that was inward double whipped chain. At the end, we're just going to go back down through the fabric and tie it off, and then we're going to move on to our very last third on this outer ring, which is going to be outward double whipped chain. So now for this outward double whipped chain, we're going to start the same way. We're coming up in the center of our first loop, and now we're going to be moving the needle outward. So you're starting from the center of each loop and sliding the needle underneath one leg towards the outside. And you're just going to continue doing that inside to outside all the way to the end. Once again, when you get to the end, you've now whipped both sides of your chain. You're just gonna go back down through the fabric and tie it off. I love the look of these chain stitches with the whipping on top of them, so I really hope that you enjoyed them too. For our next tutorial, we're actually going to be moving back to the beginning of this circle and filling in all of those extra stitches that you can see a little preview of right now. There's a lot of fun ones in here. There's some that are actually, I'd say they're the first difficult or at least like intermediate level stitches that we're hitting on in this sampler. So it's definitely getting more complicated now and therefore more exciting, more satisfying when you get the hang of these stitches. So I hope you guys enjoyed doing these whipped chain stitches with me, and I will see you next time for our next tutorial. Thanks very much for watching.